Hey, I'm Morgan, and this is the PS We Expire podcast.
If I had a magic wand to wave around the world, around people's emotions, it would be to increase people's capacity to tolerate their emotional distress and the emotional distress of others.
It's been a minute since I did any kind of introduction to my podcast. Usually I just launch into the interview right away, but there's a couple things that I want to talk about in regards to what you're about to hear on this episode. I was really interested in having a conversation with someone about this particular topic around the manosphere, the red pill, the masculinity, femininity, divide, kind of tension, all of this stuff that we see online with these male influencers who are having a tremendous impact on boys and young men and the way that they think about women, the way that they think about themselves, the way that they think about what their part to play is in the world at large. And with the political and ideological tension that's happening right now, I feel like this is a really important question of what can we do, really? And I'm thinking about it primarily through the perspective of being a mom. And I know that many of the people who listen to this podcast happen to be in the same demographic that I do. Maybe you have children that are still school aged, whether they're elementary school, junior high, or high school, maybe college. And we want to know, how do we protect our kids from some of this nonsense? How do we equip them to face it head on with critical thinking, with empathy, with compassion, and that some of the harmful messaging, particularly for boys, doesn't get turned inward. So I wanted to invite Dr. Brendan Hartman, K. Hartman, on the podcast because I really like his approach to the way that he talks about these things. And I know that his demographic, people that he has worked with for a long time, are exactly smashed in this demographic that I'm talking about as a parent. So between the time that I recorded this episode with him and the date that I'm publishing it right now, I watched the new Netflix documentary from Louis Theroux, which is Inside the Manosphere. And so many of the things that we talk about in this episode relate directly to some of the patterns that we see captured in this documentary. If you haven't watched it yet, highly recommend. It's really, really important to see how boys in particular are responding to the type of things that the men that are in this documentary are talking about, making money off of, and becoming, kind of like internet famous for the things that they're talking about. So it's good to equip yourselves not only just to know what's out there, but to know what to do to combat some of this. The two takeaways that I got both from the documentary and from my conversation with Dr. Hartman, number one is that we have to talk to our kids about this stuff. We can't just assume that they're fine. We can't assume that they're absorbing the ways that we think about things. We have to have real boots on the ground conversations with them that are really clear, also age appropriate, of course, about what kinds of things they're exposed to online. Which brings me to number two, which I know is infinitely harder and can be really difficult to figure out practically what this means, but we have to be really good about monitoring our kids' online access and online use. So we have to be checking what they're seeing on YouTube. We have to be noticing the accounts that they're following on their social media, if at all possible, to delay the time that they're on social media. But we also can't stick our heads in the sand and not prep our kids for how to be savvy online. So there's a lot of weight and a lot of pressure on parents who are paying attention to know what to do with our kids. So I think that if you are in that position, you have children and you're wondering, what do I do? I think this episode is going to be really helpful for that. A couple of housekeeping things before I get into the episode. Number one, if you haven't heard yet, I have a resource vault on my website that is a ton of free resources because I was like, I've got all of this good stuff that I've made over the years. Where can I put it where it's a one-time sign up with your email and then you have access to all these things that I've made? So I've got journal prompts, guided meditations, an intro to meditation course that you can take. All of this stuff is free. So just go to morganmotzinger.com/resource resource vault. Oh, sorry. morganmotzinger.com/vault, and put your email address in there. Free forever. Have access to those things. And then as I update them, you'll get added to the email list. And as I update the resource vault, you'll get email notifications if I add any new goodies. Secondly, if you haven't subscribed to this podcast yet, would you please just go ahead and do that? Just take a quick second. Instead of just listening to the episode, go ahead and subscribe. If you are so inclined and you would like to leave a review, I would also greatly appreciate it. I'm really excited about some of the podcast guests that I have coming up soon, and I don't want you to miss who those are. So go ahead and hit subscribe on that so you get notifications when these new podcast guests are coming. I am so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that you're listening to this episode, and I think that you will come away from it feeling not only really empowered to make decisions that are positive and important for our kids and for ourselves, but that you also will come away with a sense of that there is something that you can do. It's really easy to be bogged down in a real sense of hopelessness, but this is going to give you some practical ways that actually are much more simple than we might think to not only connect with our kids and to help protect them from some of this stuff, but also just to have an awareness of what people really need at a basic human fundamental level, and how we can create more opportunities to connect with each other in this weird human soup that we're in. So thanks for joining me. Looking forward to sharing this episode with you.
Our ability to handle the discomfort of other people's distress and our own distress is super related. And I think that the world would be a lot better of a place. And I think of the parenting experience. My dysregulation has never regulated my children. And so I guess that's one thing I'm continually excited to learn about as my children age, is just the windows and the opportunities to reflect and to kind of meet myself at a younger age. Or I find myself saying things of or I find myself thinking things sometimes with my children that you oh, you don't know how easy you got it, or I would have never have done this when I was a kid. And I feel like I have enough progressive labels that I don't say those things out loud, but I definitely think them. And just realizing that I can take an opportunity to look in the mirror and that I don't have to do things the same way, or the fact that oh yeah, there's some things I grew up and I'm really proud of the hard things I went through, and it's really important for children to have hard things to go through. But seeing my children not just as mini me's, but being they're just humans in their own right with different personalities, and two of my children are twins, and so it's really a good litmus test just to see. I love seeing them have areas where it is so obvious nothing to do with me. One of them just loves crocheting, and it's this is a skill that I have never learned, and they're just super passionate about it, and it's just so cool. So I guess I'm excited about learning about my kids, because I'm going towards that, because normally I would have a million things to tell you about things I'm excited to learn about, but I will just be honest and say that I've had it harder to find hope in the last couple months. Even though my work, I'm very hope-filled. I do this work because I have a lot of hope. And working with boys and men and parents and youth of all genders, face-to-face, it gives me so much hope. But I think I've spent more time on the internet, and that's often what depletes my hope the most. So I'm coming at you from a bit more depleted energy, if I'm honest.
Well, a couple of things about what you said. One is having twins is every social psychologist or researcher's dream. To be able to do a twin study in their own home is really exciting. But I agree with you 100% that hope is a necessary ingredient to change. Because if there's no hope that things could be better or things could be different, then what's the point of any of the things that we're doing? So I'm just really curious, how do you navigate your own sense of hopelessness, how does that show up in your work? What types of things do you do to take care of yourself when you're feeling that?
That's a great question. My answer would just be, well, okay, this might be sound so woo woo, but I generally have a tell when I haven't been feeling my feelings. And my tell is I generally get very vivid and symbolic dreams at night when I know I haven't been feeling my feelings. Like I'm cognitively aware of all these different things going on, but that's often a sign. And usually they come in threes for whatever reason. That I have 3 nights in a row, and then I'm like, okay, something has to give here. I need to devote more time to whether not mindfulness per se. Like I do a lot of breath work. I am an amateur free diver, and so that's like a practice that goes by the wayside. The more stressed and the more doom scrolling and the more hopeless I feel. Generally, my tells are dreams. It's moving away from play with my friends. I mean, just hanging out with my friends and community. So when I withdraw, that's a sign. And so the counter to that is to seek connection. And I also sleep sabotage often in those states. So I guess my first answer is I map all the things and I draw awareness to the things that perpetuate the cycle of hopelessness. And then playing music on my guitar, giving myself time away from work is such a battle within me because I want to be productive and being a busy parent trying to do all these things. It's like I don't have time. Like I am an expert around emotions, and I have to admit I'm not an expert around emotions because they come easily to me. I think I'm in it because I know how important they are and how hard it is sometimes. And so I'm often stuck between I need to be productive, and it's like my emotions aren't productive. But it's like, how many times, Brendan, do I have to relearn that actually spending like half an hour to sit with my feelings? Maybe it's just starting journaling it. Maybe some emotion and like tears come. That's always great if it does, because I feel like the somatics matter so much. But how many times do I have to realize that like, oh, feeling your feelings is like feeling through them is actually paradoxically does end up making me more productive, even if it feels like I'm going off and taking like a break. Emotions are such a necessary part of our lives and our world, so I try to devote more time to that and take care of my sleep.
Those are, oh man, such good insight into number one, that emotions are not the problem, but they're always feedback for things that just need to be addressed. They need to be looked at. And I'm someone who can really easily slip into cognitive evaluation of my feelings instead of actually feeling my feelings. And so I appreciate the attention to work that actually encourages you to be in your body instead of just kind of like what's going on from the neck up. And the thing that I find really interesting about dreams, and I only know this because we're focusing on that just this last week and this week in my neuroscience class, like what's actually how is the brain using sleep states to do things like memory consolidation, learning. And one of the things that I just read about was how these researchers were having their participants listen to audiobooks before they went to sleep. And then when they saw on the EEG that they were in a REM cycle, they would wake them up and say, what were you dreaming about? And then based on what the participants were saying their dreams were about, then people who were not familiar with the audiobooks or didn't know which audiobooks they had listened to as they were falling asleep had to guess which one they were listening to. And like they got it correct more than just chance. So it's like significantly or statistically significant, which means to me that some of the things that are on our periphery that maybe we're not giving conscious awareness to, and depending on what our brain state is while we're thinking about those things. So often as we're falling asleep, we might be kind of perseverating on some of the things in the day or some of the things that we're not really thinking about. Then our brain is like, okay, I'm going to try and make sense now of this stuff. And so like vivid dreams that are like hey, here's some things that's on the periphery of our life, these emotional things that are happening that we're not really giving conscious attention to. It's like your brain's bringing that then to a place to be able to process that. I think that's a really interesting tell. And what I like about you sharing the things that you've noticed about yourself is that it's like taking a scientific lens to ourselves and being like, what are the things that I notice in myself that indicate that these types of things need attention, and also testing how those impact you in your daily life. So, I think a lot of people are like, oh, there's all these lists of things that I could be doing. I need to meditate, and maybe I need to listen to these mantras, or I need to do breath work, or I need to take a walk in the woods. I need to do forest bathing. And then they get overwhelmed and they're like, I'm not going to do anything then. So it's like becoming this little scientist to test what things work for you and when.
Yeah, and one of my favorite like neuroscience tidbit around that is when we have like the narrative, oh, I should be doing these things, or I must, or I ought to. It's a different pathway in our brain that tends to be more in our limbic system of like fight, flight, high emotions, and it makes us less likely to actually do the thing. Whereas if we are able to frame that list of things, being like, I get to choose whether I'm going to do this or not, like getting that autonomy back gets more of your prefrontal cortex online and can make you more agentic in actually doing the things you want to do. So every time, I guess another tell is like when I get to all these shoulds, and there's some sayings of like, don't should yourself, stop shoulding yourself. and I think there's so much value. I was actually really disheartened when I did my PhD, and I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but I did fairly quickly just see that academics can easily have their heads so disconnected from their hearts. In indigenous culture, something I might be saying it wrong, but Dweebin knowledge is like heart knowledge and head knowledge is like really actually dangerous if it's divorced from one another. And I think about that often, and I think that like one of the reasons why I left academia full time to do on the ground work is not a fear of becoming just the ivory tower, but just realizing like there's such a disconnect between theory and lived experiences. And it is so much more powerful realizing, or I've realized I can't be a hypocrite in this work, or I could be. I could actually probably become a great speaker being a hypocrite. People do it all the time. But when I'm actually like working with teenagers themselves, like I love that they can they can call out bullshit really easily as well. Yeah. And I appreciate that because it's helped me actually become a better human, a better version of myself, realizing that I need to be putting these things into practice. I just resonate with what you said about kind of the head cognitive knowledge.
I want to go back for a second to something that you said about when we're feeling in these spirals of what should I do, and that the introduction of agency into that, when we recognize that we do have a choice on what to do, it seems to me like the agentic piece is a direct connection to hopefulness. So usually we feel kind of in despair when we get to the spot where we don't think we can actually do anything, either about our changes in our own life, or when we're looking at the world at large and being like, I'm like one tiny person, what can I do here? And what I like so much about your work is it seems to me to be a recognition of the larger problems, but becomes really practical and tangible in like, how do you do this in your life with this one person? Like, how do you impact, for many of my listeners, how do you impact your children? How do you impact the people just directly connected to you? Because most of us are not in positions where we have influence over a ton of people. Even people who have a lot of followers online are typically only known for, one or two things. And so they may not have the depth that's necessary to having more of those personal interactions with people. So if you don't mind, could you talk maybe a little bit about your shift from academia into the work that you do now. You already talked a little bit about how you don't want to be trapped in the kind of the neck up way of operating and living in the world. But maybe you can talk about the work that you do now and why it matters to you.
Yeah, I can absolutely talk about my work. How do I want to talk about it? I think going in how you frame that question, I left, I got into this work for many reasons, but maybe the first surface level reason is because one of my favorite students, when I was a high school teacher, died from suicide. And that made me look into mental health, found out that 81% of students diagnosed with emotional behavioral disorders are male. And I was like, how much of this is socialization? How much is biology? I used to be a biology and a history teacher. Got into special education and led a group for boys and that have behavioral disorders. And I think that one of the reasons that I got into this is realizing that there's a lot of children going through adolescence feeling alone. And that was when I asked teenage boys in my PhD research who are 18 years old, what's the number, if you had to describe what it's like being a teenage boy in one word, what would that be? And in my research, the number one word was lonely. Now, when I go around to schools, often the number one word I hear is like confusing. There's a lot of different answers, but those tend to be very common. And I never would have looked back in my high school years as an adult being like, oh, I was lonely. Because my understanding of lonely would be like not having friends. But these boys who said they were lonely didn't have a lack of friends. A lot of them had a lot of friends, but they felt alone in their experiences. And it goes back to like Dr. Brene Brown's work around the opposite of belonging is fitting in. It's because belonging, you're being accepted for who you are. Fitting in is changing yourself to be accepted. And I guess I do this work because I want boys and men to see themselves clearly, and they have also helped me. Feminist theory has helped me see myself more clearly as well, and that has made me live with more integrity and intention. It is, I see it helping people in their relationships, and I think one of the things that is so important is that I don't think the world changes for the better from having like these huge charismatic influencers in boys and men's life. It's the people who are in the arena with them, coaches, parents, teachers, communities, parents of friends that take people under their wing and give different mentorship. Like, we have such an important role, and I think we can get really scared about the algorithms online, and in many ways we should be quite scared of what boys, all genders, are exposed to with very gendered algorithms. But at the same time, we, I think, overlook how significant the insular small communities and connections that you have. Because, yeah, I can speak to thousands of kids each year, but it's ongoing work with like that relationship with the teacher, that specific adult, or just an older peer mentor. Like, some of my favorite things to do is working with grade 11 and 12 boys, or I don't. So a lot of my work started male focused, but now it's all genders because I focus on how gender and wellness intersect, and I don't believe in the suffering contest. I think all genders their health needs to improve for the benefit of all others. So one of my favorite buy-ins for adult men as well is like, hey, can we do like this program where like I'll teach you some stuff and then you implement that and mentor that with the younger boys, and that has created such good buy-in, and so many boys and men are like, I don't really need it for myself, but I will do it for someone else. And I know that sounds kind of manipulative, but I also feel that within me too, that like, oh, if I can help someone else with the knowledge I'm getting, that makes me much more open to doing it. And so those are some of the different things that I do. Like, my favorite thing is going around to schools, working with youth, working with teachers, and working with parents as well, because I think it's a community effort.
Yeah. I think one of the pieces of all of this that I struggle with, like the hope part of it is, yeah, I totally get that in the day to day, in the gritty part of life, it's going to be the people that we're actually physically in the room with. But it feels challenging just from like a time perspective to compete with the amount of time that people are spending on their devices. It's and I think particularly about what's happening in the brain for kids at this age is frightening to me, in terms of if we're thinking about neuroplasticity and what's being laid down in childhood that then has consequences lifelong. And the just for listeners who are not familiar with this idea, I know most people have heard of neuroplasticity, but what's happening in the brain for a developing child is there's a lot of pruning that's going on. So there's a lot of connections between different parts of the brain, and these networks are laid down mostly by things that are emotionally salient. So the things that have like a big emotional impact, there's like a stronger connection to these parts of the brain, and a lot of cutting off of unnecessary skills, or things that are not shored up in, especially in their day-to-day life. Those things are going to be harder to develop into adulthood. And so the adolescent brain in particular, infant up to adolescent, I think is like such a critical time for brain development, not just in terms of skills, but also the way that they think about the world, the perspectives they have on the world are being developed in a really powerful way at those ages. And so I have to like battle my own sense of hopelessness when I see things that that are online that are so destructive to relationships, really is what it boils down to. It's like, and this is one of the things that I wanted to ask you, if we can get into the weeds a little bit on some of the work that you do, because you said you like talking about the intersection of gender and wellness. So could you expound on that a little bit? Talk about what you mean, and some of the things when we're talking about masculine versus feminine and male versus female from either a sociological or biological or neurological perspective.
Absolutely. So wellness in schools, often like the key word is like social emotional learning. Social learning of like how we interact with others, interpersonal and intrapersonal as well, and then emotional being how we connect with emotional intelligence, emotional resilience. That's a huge keyword in education. But one of the failings in it, I would say, or my critiques of it, is they don't often account for how gender changes our buy-in with social emotional learning, as well as it changes a different messages and different skin in the game around these concepts. And so I call like a lot of the work that I do with schools is like gender conscious social emotional learning. So yes, emotional intelligence skills are really important and across the board for all genders. But the fact that boys tend to get socialized away from fear and sadness, girls tend to get socialized away from externalized anger. A lot of boys have a really weird relationship with anger where they might be really prone to it, but they're also very afraid of it. And they only experience anger in a hyper aroused state, which is like a state of rage, and they don't understand all the purposes of anger. And so it's really looking at like how does your experience as a boy, as a girl, as a gender expansive individual, how does that change your wellness and holistic health throughout life? And there's different kind of developmental stages that are really important to be aware of. I call these like the two boy crises around ages 5 and age 14 for boys. For girls, it's around grade 5, grade 6, where they are at a greater risk of disconnecting from authentic parts of themselves. And so these are more sociological in nature as opposed to like biological realities. And I'll just give you an example that on average boys as babies are more emotional than girls are on average. And lots of this research is very binary. They don't have much on transgender or non-binary people. So just want to mention that for your listeners. So on average, baby boys have more verbal fussiness as well as verbalizations of joy as a baby. That changes around age 2 to 3 when language starts to develop, where girls become more verbally expressive than boys on average. But boys actually still continue to display more emotionality on their faces. And that changes around kindergarten, age 5, where boys become less facially expressive than girls as well. And they've done research to try and assess whether that's a sign of repression or suppression. So suppression would be more of a conscious process, and repression would be more unconscious. And most of the evidence indicates that this is actually a sign of suppression, that boys and men are actually like actively, somewhat consciously choosing to have a flatter affect on their face as well. And so that should change how we respond. And yes, maybe the same skills of emotional intelligence are important, but your experiences and your stories that you have learned and made up around different emotions are very different depending on your gender, on your race, on different aspects of your lived experience. And so that is where I'm also coming from. And then another aspect of my work is this is the most Gen Alpha, Gen Z is the most politically divided in American history. It's the most romantically divided. So a huge part of my work is bridging gender divides and even working like corporate on teams of navigating different gender dynamics. I end up going to a lot of schools, working with the students, and then often we have to then work with the teachers of realizing the gender imbalances on staff. Or I often frame things as like, these are some of the most harmful messages that tend to be given to boys and men are suppress your emotions, need to be hyper independent, and need to be dominant, and that your value comes through what you produce. And these things are harmful when they're rigid and restrictive. There's times and places for all of these, I would argue, just like all human behavior has a time and place, but when they become rigid and restrictive, that's when it becomes harmful. So those are the 4 main harmful messages given to boys and men. For girls and women, the 3 most harmful ones are prioritize others' comfort over your own, diminish your own power and voice, and your value comes through your physical appearance. And for gender expansive individuals, that would be you are you're subhuman, or you're inherently not valuable, or you're lesser than, and you constantly have to prove that you even have a right to exist. So that's some of the most harmful messaging given to them from like a psychological standpoint. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to gain awareness of this and to try and have like a healthier balance of, I really like this idea that almost, you might have heard of it, that almost anything can be a medicine or a drug depending on its intent. And like I'm a huge fan of the research coming out around psychedelics, and like literally psychedelics can absolutely be a drug. I've had a former student die from psychedelic drug incident, so I know the harms of it. But I've also known people that have had their PTSD like crazily healed from psychedelics, and so much depends on your intent around it. And so I view like masculinity, femininity, the most strategic or most helpful framing that I've found in my work, because it gets so controversial, is like, when does this idea or this belief, behavior around masculinity or femininity, when does it become helpful and when does it become harmful? And that's kind of my approach.
One of the things that we were just talking about before I hit record on this was how grief in particular helps us be more friendly with the gray areas of life, and that the more unexpected or difficult things we face, depending on how we kind of alchemize those experiences, help us be more comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. And so I think one of the helpful ways that I've thought about sex and gender is that it's even across male and female, it's really a spectrum of personalities, of preferences. And so what would you say to people who are like, No, there's like very obvious sex differences that show up in expression, in emotion, and that, you know, these things are boy or are male, and these things are women or female. And I guess I can share a little bit about the way that I think about this is growing up in a very conservative religious household was like there are super clear gender roles, and that those are not societal, those are in you, in whether you're male or female, and that's why these things are in place. And then moving out of that space and seeing some of the same framing but just under different labels of like masculinity and femininity, or like the feminine divine, or you know, like the, and so that I'm curious about like how you think about maybe some of the things that we see just floating around in the zeitgeist in either wellness or religious spaces that like to affirm that there are certain traits that are intrinsic to particular sexes.
Yeah. I would.
And that's like a big topic, a big question.
No, it's a great question. I like how I often just start. I guess if I have an agenda, my agenda is for people to get a bit less rigid and a bit more flexible. But I don't need them to come over to this from A to B. That's not my intent. My intent is like, and then why do I care about flexibility is because that leads to more flourishing for yourself and the people around you. And so in the academics, they say, like, they put your beliefs around gender or masculine and femininity on a continuum between gender essentialism or biological determinism and social constructionism. And I don't find that super helpful. I find what I have created, I guess, is like a Venn diagram of whether you think masculinity, and let's just use the definition that people will agree upon would be masculinity are behaviors, roles, characteristics, and traits commonly associated with the male sex. Where people disagree is whether that is a biological reality, whether that's a socially constructed reality, or whether that's a spiritual reality. And that these Venn diagrams can overlap. And so if you do cross-cultural analysis of the two traits or roles of men and masculinity around the world, you'll get protectors and providers. So and then I just highlight this example, and maybe I'll just take you through it if that's fine.
Yeah, please.
Should I continue? Okay. So protectors and providers. If you come from a purely biological standpoint, then you're going to say, okay, yeah, protectors and providers. Men on average have higher muscle mass, are taller, and so they are more skilled or better equipped for taking down big game. And so for providing meat or protection, they're the ones, like, that just makes sense for their role. It's a biological imperative. Then you go from a pure social constructed perspective, you would say that the way that we even define those words is highly subject to change. So like we define protectors and providers as physical protection and financial provision nowadays, but we could easily redefine those in different terms and come up with like different arguments that like women do, or like the fact that women who breastfeed, it's like a 40-hour a week job. It's like a huge thing. So like, couldn't that be also classified as provision? So it's literally the way that we even write these words can skew our perceptions of them. Because you could then look at the states, like one, if not, I believe the single most cause of death of pregnant women in the United States is from domestic violence from their partner. And you could be like, well, that obviously is not men as protectors. So just like you can construct men as protectors, you can deconstruct these things as well. And so that would be more social constructionist. And the example I often use that resonates with people is like, because I'm actually not a pure social constructionist. I have overlap of these circles. But I use the example of cowboys, is that cowboys nowadays are kind of seen as like a rugged, like an ideal masculinity. Like it's not like a diss if someone calls you cowboy. It might be weird to, hey cowboy, it might be weird, but it's not like your masculinity is being super questioned if you're compared to like a John Wayne type character. But the part of the reason why they were called cowboys at the time is because they were not seen in their era as respectable, mature men. They were prone to anger. They were gambling. They didn't own land, so they weren't in this like manliness, mature homeowner type of way. And at the same time, there's a huge racial element to it. Lots from Vanquetos. I don't know much Spanish, but also there was a lot more black cowboys than people realize as well. And this is part of the reason that enslaved people in America were often, the men were denied manhood and were called boys throughout their whole life, as one way just to keep them under. And so when you had the Civil Rights Million Man March movement in the United States, you had so many black men carrying signs, "I am a man," because they had been denied manhood. And so our definitions of what's like a really respectable, idyllic masculinity changes in different social classes and changes across time as well. And so that's just one example of how our understandings of masculinity can be constructed differently in different time periods. But then the probably closest to your question, the top Venn diagram of are these things a spiritual imperative? And often that can overlap in lots of religious communities of like, well, men are the leaders of the household, partly biology, but also it's like it's a spiritual mandate from God. But then you also know other religious people are like, well, the spiritual mandate is to also serve the church as Christ served the church. And so people can construct different meanings of what a Christian masculinity is using the example of Jesus or different passages of the Bible. So people are arguing within the Bible about what the ideal masculinity is. So you can have a spiritual masculinity that's closer to a spiritual belief around masculinity that's a bit more rigid, more closer to like a biological essentialism. But then there's also flexibility within spirituality of like, I'll even put Carl Jungian, the idea of the anima and the animus, the feminine inside the masculine, or the masculine inside the male, the feminine female body, or indigenous, like two-spirited, that there's a gambit where I see like the mythopoetic archetypes of masculinity and femininity, sacred masculinity, divine masculinity. Sometimes I see those being used in very rigid and patriarchal, oppressive ways, and sometimes I see them as really like, oh, like kind of embodied and really flourishing type of ways, and it's complex. But that's how I kind of just describe it, and I just want people to be aware that there's a multitude of different elements here, and again, that's where I would start the conversation.
I love that. One of the things that came to mind is this idea of that maleness is protect and provide. It seems to me that maybe one of the dominant characteristics also of maleness is domination, is having someone who you are able to subject to your own will. And that's one of the dynamics I kind of see even within, religious or spiritual is the submissive woman. That's like really heralded as like the peak kind of dance between the male and the female.
Yeah, it is. And if you think back to some of the most harmful messaging that are given to men and women, it's like the most harmful messages is the need to be dominant and have power over others. And one of them is to suppress your own power and your voice and to be small for women. But of course, that's also a safety mechanism. But this is like some of the most depressing research is that in heterosexual relationships, women who suppress their conflict with their partner, accounting for all of the variables, like have 7 times higher early mortality. So like it's bad for anyone to suppress their emotions, but like, and I am very well acquainted I taught at a Christian university, a gender education class, and it's so hard because everyone's trying to play the no true Scotsman fallacy of like, well, that's not real biblical gender roles. It's not oppressive. And I see that argument. Like there's a huge difference between people in a heterosexual relationship living out biblical gendered roles where they are consenting and authentic living in it versus ones that like are suppressed something that they would like that they're not happy within it. And I think some of it it's so complex because it happens in feminist circles too. Oh, you're not a true feminist. Or like this is real feminism. And with Christianity and feminism, I have come to the point of I just want to take people where they're at on their, like, if they call themselves a Christian, regardless of how it espouses, I'm gonna just keep that in the collective of all that it is, because I feel like it actually avoids accountability. Like, I don't want to be part of any ism that doesn't have the capacity for self-critique. And if I just say, oh, well, you're not a true whatever I am part of as well, then it's kind of absolving, like, oh, this isn't some of the messiness and complicatedness that is ascribed to humans adhering to a label. And I guess it goes back to what you're saying is like, oh, people's capacity for messiness, people handling, it goes back to my waving the wand, handling their emotional distress and the emotional distress of others. Like, can I handle the distress that someone disagrees with me, or the distress that, like, as a boy growing up in evangelical, like, I was so stressed that all my friends were going to hell. And I tried to convert them. I was not successful as a kid, and I'm glad as an adult now that I wasn't, because it came from such a terrible. Well, as a kid, I have more compassion for how it came out. But I would just say that we can get stuck thinking that we're loving someone and it's actually dehumanizing them. And we can justify, like, if you look into the psychology behind how we can justify how I can tell you that I'm going to brainwash you, and even telling you that I can then still brainwash you. Like, the research behind it is unsettling, that I just don't know how you can't just embrace a bit more gray. Actually, I know how you can embrace a bit more gray, because it requires more uncertainty. And to tie this back into masculinity and everything else, that people in my position and academics, I think, have gone astray in that we have deconstructed masculinity, and then we've deconstructed the harms with it, and that has been really needed and necessary. But we have a difficulty reconstructing something because we can always critique the reconstruction of it. However, we should pay attention to that boys and men who consume red-pilled content, which is like feminism has gone too far, women are the privileged ones in society, men aren't, and also that at the end of the day, women only want men who are attractive and have a lot of money. Boys and men who consume and enjoy that content have higher optimism about life, and also research shows boys and men who are more rigid in the man box self-report a greater sense of purpose in life, even though those who are more rigid have like compared to men who aren't in the man box have like a 6 times higher rate of suicide attempts. Even though it's bad for their health and other people's health, their sense of purpose is higher. And so the black and white boxes, the clear guidance, why do teenage boys, why do like 1 in 6 of them view Andrew Tate as a role model, even though he's super misogynistic? It's not his misogyny. The number one thing that they say is they love that he is confident enough to say what's on his mind, even if it's not politically correct. And he gives like tangible black and white guidance of what it is to be a man today. And when everyone's deconstructing it, that gets more and more attractive. And so I think there is just a need for the messiness of recognizing that not everyone's journey towards healing is going, it can't look the same. And I think it's really hard for us humans who've like maybe deconstructed from some aspect that was really harmful to be like, everyone has to go through the same journey and not remember the journey it took to get there. And I think we need to also have compassion for people who are at different stages in that as well.
Which is so annoying because if there was a formula, that would be the best.
Oh,
What
it,
what occurred to me is the is that perhaps one of the reasons why boys and young men look up to people like Andrew Tate is exactly what you said. It's like they speak their mind. What that signals to me is that they are praised for emotional expression, even if it's couched in these really harmful ideologies and this really harmful rhetoric. At least they're expressing themselves, and that is rewarded if it's expressed like in this way. And I don't think I'd really like thought about that before, that, because I've heard people say that about Trump, is like, what I like about him is that he like speaks his mind. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like that's what a lot of, to your point about how one of the main things that is consistent with women is the suppression of the anger, is the suppression of saying how you really feel. And it seems to me like maybe this is the same problem dressed up just a little bit differently. It's like, do I have safe spaces to actually express how I really feel about something? And I've thought about this a lot when I took a sports psychology class, and we were talking about race and gender within sports. And we spent a lot of time looking at bias, racism, prejudice, and understanding the difference between implicit and explicit bias. And I think one of the things that struck me about this class is like, they had us take these, was it an IAT test, where you do these really quick responses to matching words to emotions.
yes.
And it's a way to uncover ways that you think about things that you didn't even know that you thought about them that way. And what
Implicit
occurred to
bias
me,
test, right?
yes,
Isn't
yeah, bias test.
yeah.
So, you could do ones on race or body type or gender. And what occurred to me is, what do we do when we recognize that we have a bias? So I had a bias that showed up that I was not even aware of when it came to body image. And I was like, if I'm not resourced enough, like if I don't have somebody to either talk to about this or have enough skills myself to reflect on this bias, I'm going to suppress it and it's going to continue. So even if there's like an inkling of awareness of something like racism or bias towards, body type, for example, or genders, if I don't have a place to explore that safely, then it's going to persist. And so I wonder if that's like kind of where it ties into this idea of people being able to express these like harmful thoughts that they have, without a way to talk about them, like to be able to bring them into the light in a safe way, to then be able, like, okay, we're looking at what we have to deal with now. Does that make sense?
There's so many things I want to say, but maybe like I loved, and there's so many different things I want to respond to. But I think at the end of the day, maybe one of the most sad and important things in researching emotions is that it doesn't really matter what is, it matters what people perceive things are.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so it doesn't really matter what the reality is, but there are the boys and men drawn to people like Andrew Tate and the red pilled, black pilled pipeline don't feel seen and heard. And we could spend all day arguing about if they do feel seen and heard, or like we've given so much space. But the reality is, like, all humans need and want to feel seen and heard. And if they don't, it's also socialized more in guys, that like the quickest way to avoid introspection is to externalize it, the anger, as an outward facing emotion for the most part. You can, of course, turn anger against yourself inward. Women are socialized away from externalizing aggression, but they can definitely be angry at themselves, self-hatred or whatever. But boys and men themselves, like the talking points of Andrew Tate, yeah, we get to this point where we do need to have what I call dangerous conversations. And this is some of my favorite workshops to have with teenage boys, which I tell them like, and now I have a list of all of these topics from all of these different workshops, and I often just show it because it's quicker, because they're like, hey, what do you want to talk about? But I used to just get them to write down like, what's a topic that you have questions about, that you want to talk about, that you don't think you can, or don't think any adults around you really want to. And like after Charlie Kirk died, there was a lot of schools I was going to in the States that like, yeah, they want to process what they're seeing, what's going on. And so a lot of boys are growing up feeling like they can't share their genuine opinions. And a lot of them, I would say the majority of them, are actually genuinely confused about why they can't ask these questions, but they don't want to offend people. And then that also builds to resentment, and ends up becoming way more harmful, because then they're in the echo chamber online hearing these things, and it's kind of validating everything I haven't said because they haven't had that processed. And it's way more difficult for teachers to have it when you have to deal with the safety of everyone in the room. When I come to a school intentionally focused on these different subjects, or I'm working one-on-one with a family, I have a huge advantage because I'm coming in for that purpose. But like literally the number one thing that teenage boys often want to ask me about is how to stop being addicted to pornography and other things that they love. They want to talk about, like red pilled, black pilled, loneliness, addictions to social media, also to like gambling, isolation, loneliness, going through breakups. There's all of these things that I think there is a disservice being done to how we're raising boys. Actually, how we're raising kids in this culture is also very difficult, because everything can be permanent and online forever. And so the room for messiness, ironically, there's less room for messiness, and it's become so much messier because of that. Because there's things can get like, everything can be narcissism, or everything can be gaslighting. And it's like, there is legitimate gaslighting and narcissism, and red flags we should be aware about. But there's also like, everything can be pop psychology, love bombing, and dating relationships, but also just the early stages of dating relationships. And then in the adolescent brain, you have your limbic system that's proliferating way more than your prefrontal cortex. And so your feelings of limerence or everything is just going to be way more intense than later on in life, just because of your brain development as well. And so that is just also a normal thing. And I think sometimes we can get so nuanced and everything is so labeled, that we've missed the messiness of human connection. And it's just very complicated. But I would say that my best conversations and the biggest impetus for change and hope is actually having these uncomfortable, dangerous conversations, because that's actually what's needed. Because people, and boys especially, do not want these sanitized things, because they will be exposed to unsanitized things on the internet. And so we do have to meet them where they're at, and just also treat them with a bit more agency. And this goes back to what you were saying about bias. I can speak to this confidently about teacher bias. It's that the teachers who don't think they're biased are actually some of the most biased. And so I'm going to challenge one thing that you said, because you said, if I don't explore my biases, then things can just, like, I have to just suppress them. Like, that's absolutely true. But if you even admit that you have bias, you're already way ahead. And then one answer of like, what can you do if you recognize your bias? And as a teacher, here's one example. As a high school teacher, if I saw a student's paper with messy handwriting and they were a male, I never thought twice. If they were a female, I would think twice. And if it was a male with like super neat printing, that would catch my eye. I would notice that. And research shows how much our expectations for students matter so much to their achievement. And so, yes, there is some biological evidence not overwhelming for a certain part of the population of boys that they might need a bit more movement, but it's kind of mixed. It's not this like the education system is totally not designed for boys. It's like a couple hundred years ago, education systems were way more strict and only designed for only boys were allowed to go to school. So there's some biological evidence, but there's so much evidence that like our biases and perceptions at a young age of what boys are capable of limits them in certain areas that we think should be limited, and it also expands them in certain areas where we think that they have more skills towards. So being aware of these biases are really important. And then the quick correction would be we need to have higher expectations of boys in areas where we have low, and we need to have higher expectations of girls in areas where it's not. Like, I want to celebrate when a girl student disrupts the classroom and takes up more linguistic and physical space in the classroom, because I know the research shows that boys are allowed more linguistic and physical space in the classroom. So like it's not like I want one to totally balance the other, but I want to encourage girls in areas where they've been socialized against, and I want to have high expectations for boys in areas where they've been socialized not to have high expectations.
That makes perfect sense.
Sorry, I kind of feel like I'm just, my energy to be retrospective, and one of my favorite takeaways actually that I would love parents to have is this idea. I didn't make it up. One of my clients actually heard it from somewhere, and I love it. Be an emotional sportscaster. So as an adult, one of the best ways to teach emotional intelligence is to model it by describing what is going on in your system right now. And this is how, as an former educator, actually I guess I still am, this is true of how do you get students to learn how to take notes. You describe, as you're reading a passage, how you would take notes of what's going on in your head. And so that's exactly what you need to do for emotions. So for me, loving this conversation, and I always feel like I have a pressure that like I should make sure that the audience gets something really valuable and really practical. But I kind of got lost in the conversation, and I'm getting more animated, and my emotional arousal is kind of like high here, and it's not unpleasant, but I am realizing, maybe also my ADHD might get more intense the higher I get as well. And so that's just me noticing, okay, what's my body in this moment doing? And then I can adjust accordingly, whether that's through breathing, exhaling for longer than an inhale.
Go take a break and do some free diving.
Yeah.
I really like that idea of the emotional broadcasting. It kind of reminds me of when my kids were younger, and I told my daughter, clean your room. And I remember 15 minutes later walking by her room. Her room was still a mess, and she was sitting on the floor reading a book or reading some papers that she had written, or like a little journal entry or something. And I was like, okay, why aren't you cleaning your room? And in that moment, like there was an exchange between us where I realized that she didn't know how. It was too overwhelming. And so I helped her learn how to create a list, whether it's mental or physical list of the steps to clean your room. And those are some of the things that we don't think about as adults, because again, like the prefrontal cortex is like fully online. That's the executive function. It's the future planning. And so we're not so necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of variability across like neurodivergence for sure. But this idea of how do I take something that makes sense to me with my adult brain and then teach that skill to a child who's still learning this stuff. And so to me, it seems analogous to emotional expression. Like how can I narrate to my kids what's actually happening in my brain, in my body? How do I know? Like I've asked my son this, he'll say like, I'm so angry right now. And I say, what does that feel like in your body? And being able to like help him get out of this, the thing that I struggle with, this cognitive evaluation of the emotion and actually moving into the body. Where am I feeling that? Is it a tight throat? Is it like a twist in my stomach? What is it? Your heart's beating faster? Do you feel your face flushed? These types of things where we're actually narrating the somatic experience of the emotion instead of just labeling it as something. I think that's a really important skill, which brings me to the question that I wrote down when I first knew I was going to have you on this podcast. is one of the things that you shared on your social media that I thought was really interesting is this concept of the window of tolerance. And you alluded to it a little bit earlier in the episode, but I wanted to see if you would just kind of explain what that is. And in service of what you said, one of your main goals in teaching and for yourself is to learn how to like feel your emotions well and to be able to tolerate our own distress and the distress of others. So if you could talk about the window of tolerance and how that relates to, you know, some of the other things that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. So the window of tolerance is a psychological model that just describes, so like when we're within our window, we have ups and downs around our emotional activation, our nervous system activation. And yet when we're in our window, we can still learn and reason with kind of the majority of our brain online. When we go above our window, that's called hyperarousal. That's often fight or flight response. That's when things are unsafe. Our limbic amygdala emotion center of our brain, that's more online. And then if you go below your window, that's hypoarousal, where you can get like just numbing behaviors, shutting down, and at the most extreme it'd be dissociation, where like the freeze response becomes so severe that you might lose conscious memories of different things in your life. And a good example of this is my PhD research. I had a number of international students from Eastern Asian countries that were living in Canada, and they had failed an exam in grade 9 or in grade 8 to get them into like a top university over in their countries. And so either their families had sent them here because they failed the test, or sometimes the whole families moved to Canada because they failed that test and they're carrying so much shame. And when they were reflecting on that experience, a couple of them said like, I don't even remember who my friends were in that time period. Like I can't remember anyone's faces. And I'm not diagnosing anything, but those are signs of dissociation from a really high intense stressor. And so what you were saying earlier, and this model is so helpful because, too, as a parent, knowing where your kid is on this scale is going to also change your response. Like when your kid is already in rage, in hyper arousal, you're going to respond differently versus like the ideal is you catch them before they leave their window. So you see them going up or you see them going down, and then you implement some strategy. And just very quickly, the research is so overwhelmingly clear, especially with raising boys, that when you're getting hyper aroused, the best strategy is always to slow down. So longer exhales and inhales, drinking cold water, going for a walk. One of the best things that we can give children is a regulated nervous system ourselves. So being in proximity to a regulated nervous system is one of the best ways to teach co-regulation. That is co-regulation, and that in turn actually helps them learn how to go down in their emotional intensity.
Like down-regulate.
Down-regulate, thank you. Yep. That's what I was looking for. Whereas a lot of boys, a lot of men, their strategies when they're hyper-aroused is like, I guess I'll punch something, or physical aggression, or they don't know what to do with it. And that's actually one of my greatest fears of cell phones, is not just the algorithms, but it's that those devices become quasi-emotional regulation tools, that they get us back to that numb state, and it kind of feels like we're regulated, but we don't actually really enter our zone. And this was so powerful in one of my workshops with grade 11 boys, where we named like, what are the things you do when you're hyper aroused? What are the things you do when you're hypo aroused? And it was like smoking pot, porn, cell phones, video games. And you can do video games on all 3 stages, and that's actually what I use to talk and introduce this to a lot of boys. Like, how many of you ever just played and had just like a fun time? And my favorite definition of play is when you lose track of time. Something where you just lose yourself in track of time. And so you can absolutely have fun in your window of tolerance. How many of you have ever used it because you're so stressed and you're just overwhelmed and you're just numbing out? How many of you have ever been raged and throwing a controller? And so identifying where you are in real time is really helpful. I love using it with athletes because some sports you actually need to be in a different state in order to do well. Like if you're an Olympic weightlifter, often you get like slapped on the back to try and get you into a hyper arousal. Whereas if you're a free diver, the best free divers basically get hit, like fall asleep and go super hypo regulated as they're going down into the depths. All that to say is that this boy, after we made this list and I get them to feel what it's like in their bodies to be hyper and hypo aroused, he was like, whoa, I'm like never in my window. Like I'm just numbed out, video games, pot, and then a parent or teacher says something that pisses me off, get hyper aroused, and then I just somehow drop back down. And I think that that's actually true for a lot of us in the world today, that we're living on the edges of our window. And our windows are going to be smaller based on our trauma experiences, based on systemic racism, different inequalities. So that model I find really helpful and can be taught across, like from kindergarten onwards, in just different language or different levels of intensity. But it's so great to help people notice where they are. Like so much of healing starts with awareness. I know it's such it's the first step that people don't often get excited about, of just awareness of it. Because sometimes we drown in the information. And sometimes people are so disconnected from their bodies that awareness is actually so hard. So my one encouragement is that if you don't even know where an emotion exists in your body, just be aware that you're aware that you don't know where that emotion exists. So just be like, okay, so apparently emotions are in my body. I'm just aware that I do not feel anything in my body. I'm just aware that I can't connect, that I'm not sure where I'm at. And even to say that out loud can actually be a helpful tool to down-regulate you as well.
That makes perfect sense, because if there's, I think the feeling is confusion, like you said, confusion or overwhelm, where it's like as soon as we can turn around and look at that feeling, then it's almost like that one can take a break then, and then you can look at, then you have access to some of those other things, because they're very protective feelings sometimes to keep you from going into places that your body knows maybe you're not safe to do yet.
And that reminds me back to the shoulds and what we get to do. It's like, why do I ever do personal therapy? Why do I journal? Like, I actually hate journaling. Yet I know that if I can change my emotion around that experience, I'll be way more likely to do it. And so I'm trying to tell myself, I'm actually trying to get curious. Why do I hate journaling? And then the framework for me is like, how I framed it to myself is like, oh, do I hate meeting myself? Because that's often what happens when I journal, is that I get a chance to meet myself in a way that has a bit more perspective. It's like getting curious, why is that so uncomfortable for me? And then I've had to sit with like the fact that it's like, oh, crazy that I actually have a resistance to meet myself because for whatever reasons, I have a hard time slowing down, and I would rather just like kind of get busy and avoid these feelings inside. And so stuck with curiosity, and then it's like, now I tell myself, I get to meet myself today. And having kids has been helpful too, because sometimes I don't have compassion for myself, but if I imagine how I want my kids to feel about themselves when they're adults, it's like, oh, I so want my kids to grow up wanting to meet themselves. It would make me so sad if my children didn't want to meet themselves in their own minds. So that helps me try to meet myself in my own mind.
Yeah, I like that. Sorry. It's like a it's I maybe it's undervalued or overexpressed, this idea of self-love. But from what I've seen coming out of, the field of positive psychology, is that that actually precedes things like motivation. That, usually people would think motivation and discipline come before long-lasting change. But I think what is coming up through some of the research is actually a positive regard for yourself. Taking care of yourself, loving yourself, having self-directed compassion is actually a much better catalyst for change, because you become someone who is deserving of the life that you want. that one of the things that I think is really important about this window of tolerance and comes back to so much of what you said is understanding our own tells, right? So that requires a familiarity with our own triggers and glimmers, and for people who, for whatever reason, have believed that if something is pleasant, that's an indication that you're not working hard enough. It's like the suffering is the thing that means that you're doing it right. And so some people who, are raised in that way, whatever social context or cultural or family context that is, can be really suspicious of things that feel really good or feel really purposeful or meaningful to themselves. And so I would just suggest, for people who are hesitant to believe themselves when it comes to finding things that delight them, is to actually just get really curious and add that to your toolbox. Like what I don't have to necessarily know why hugging this tree feels really nice, and it's weird, but like it feels good to me, so I'm gonna do it. Like, could we just trust some of those impulses that lead us towards health, connection with other people in a really positive way?
I love all of that and wholeheartedly agree. It's growing up in a culture that uses shame so much, and also it requires a huge paradigm shift because just like shame can create change in the short term, it's terrible for the long term. And if I could hate myself into healing, I often have said I would be the healthiest person ever, because I grew up absolutely thinking that I myself am something to dominate, that I need to have complete discipline and control over. And so it's hard to get boys and men, especially out of that dominance paradigm. But also, I actually would think that a lot of women with like disordered eatings, that like control, well, okay, let's not get into that because there's lots of different theories around the etiology of that. But that paradigm shift is hard because we live in a society that measures dominance and power over, and often platforms that. And so you have external validation of that, even though the research from like an internal level of like what actually leads to more fulfilling lives is what you mentioned, is like, can you sit with joy? We live in a culture where it would be so helpful if people who didn't destroy their bodies in the process of achieving or climbing a ladder, if those people didn't get platformed and achieve a level of success, and not all of it bad, like things are messy, that like one of my best friends was researching, he's passed away, he died in an accident, but he was researching violence against women and children, and he was a pacifist, and one of the only grown men I've ever met in my life who was like vocally a pacifist. And he grew up in like a really working class town in Scotland. And he's like, but the crazy thing is, like, I look back to all of the fights and the violence I was in growing up, and like part of me still feels some pride around that. And he was so well acquainted with violence that he was devoting his life to trying to protect and end it. But he was also not afraid to be aware of his contradictions, of like, yeah, there's this tension here that like, it's not like, hey, it's not like dominance won't make you achieve some things in life, but we have to get this paradigm shift around that, like, you win and lose at life versus, oh, can I be living? Like, can I be existing in this body? It's like a way less sexier of a cell, but like really that is what, like, this is what kind of gets spiritual again. But like for me, I'm so landed on that is the spiritual journey, that yes, we get disconnected growing up. We're always going to get disconnected from our emotions, from our bodies, from other people. And the beauties of living life is a chance to reconnect to discover, to live integrated with all these parts of ourselves, and to just notice the tension that comes on.
The thing that occurs to me about what your friend was talking about is like that sense of pride in the fighting. I wonder, because I've been thinking about this lately about the what exactly is it to have a transcendent experience? What does it look like in the brain? What does it feel like in the body? Is there consistency across people when they talk about a transcendent or a spiritual experience? Like what exactly, how would we define that? And I was just thinking about in terms of, the pride and the fight, it feels to me like it's still a recognition of the importance of proximity to aliveness, and that thread or the characteristics of aliveness that mean a full expression of our humanity. It's I think that's like what many of us are trying to do with our work is like find the way to the aliveness, but in a healthy, connecting way. So, for example, like the violence and the fighting is like movement of your body. It's like it's camaraderie somehow. It's there's like what's the utility of that? And the work of Gabor Mate, for example, is he'll ask like what has the addiction been good for? What is the drinking good for? And I like the reframing of that question because it makes me think too about if one of the most common questions that boys are wanting to talk about or young men are wanting to talk about in these workshops with you is about their porn use. What is it good for? What is it giving you? And what are some ways that you can tap into that aliveness, that vitality in a helpful and healthy way that connects you with other people and doesn't disconnect you from yourself? And I think that's one of the characteristics I think of so many of these addictions in terms of, gambling, social media, porn use is that there isn't friction between the thing that you want and being able to get there by yourself. And the messy part of that I think that people are alive to and feeling the disconnect from is that there's a lot of aliveness in the messiness too. It's in the I'm pursuing someone and they say no. Okay, what do I do now? And I love that so much. Like that's what it is to be human to me is that the friction enables us to become more closely aware with ourselves and find ways to connect with other people who are different from us, maybe have different preferences or goals than we do. And how do we be in this shared soup of humanity together, all in service of what it means to be fully human?
I think that's so beautifully said and reminds me of our conversation again before we recorded about grief bringing so much clarity. It's I don't want to have gone through the grief. I don't like putting whether it was needed or necessary, but I do think that there's the beauty of life and humans and relationships also lies in its frailty, and you couldn't really have the beauty without the frailty, or you have a diminished beauty if you try to deny its frailty. The anniversary of my friend's death is this Friday, just in a couple days from when we're recording this. And it's he was just about to become a first-time father, and so I still even though they're in Scotland, I'm here sending videos to his daughter that he never got to meet here. And it sucks and it's beautiful if you it's beautiful not to avoid things. And how do you get to learn that? It's you need to experience not avoiding things and actually making it through, and we need support often. Yes. Doing that as well. That would be really helpful to have support in it as well. But yeah, the way that we make children resilient is not from making them figure it out themselves, and it's not from being a snowplow parent, removing all obstacles in front of them. That can lead to entitlement of when you face discomfort, it's met by an immediate success. And so you need to have like a repertoire of like things that you've done that are hard to know that you can do hard things again. And so it's easier for me to feel my feelings because I have a vast library of times where I felt my feelings and I can trust the process. But it's really hard for people to trust that process. And going back to like men especially who are like disciplined in more of like a self-flagellating type of way, because that is what they've seen results from, and that befriending yourself or having more compassion to yourself feels like weakness. Or how I said earlier, that I still feel like feelings get in the way of me being more productive at work. But I have had enough experience where I know that's not the case. And I am getting over a sickness.
Oh, shoot.
Obviously, I'm not over it yet.
No problem. Sorry about your friend. That really sucks.
No, thank you.
I wonder how much people don't realize that like sitting with your feelings is a skill that you can develop, that you get better with time. And one of the most helpful things for me to remember when I'm resistant to going into the deeper recesses of my feelings is that it's all temporary. That it getting down in those is not how it's going to be now. But really like the suppression and the resistance to what is happening, a refusal to look at it, is what ends up creating a lot of problems long term.
Absolutely. Like the intense emotional oh my goodness. I don't know if I can continue.
I think we're almost done, so okay. I'll wrap it up in a minute.
Absolutely. The intense emotional valence of a feeling, if you were to fully feel it, only lasts around 90 seconds on average. And it allows us to feel the joy more so as well. And I think grief is such a powerful... It's because it's not just an emotion, it's an emotional experience. Yes. Because it contains so many emotions within it. And it's like riding that roller coaster is also a privilege too. So
as we're wrapping up, is there anything that comes to mind that you want to leave as like a parting gift for the listeners?
I actually think that the most freeing answer in this moment to me feels like, no, I don't want to give a parting gift because I feel like I'm not going to come up with anything amazing. And so I feel like sometimes a no, and as a recovering people pleaser, a no is a great response that I cheer myself for. So no, I don't have anything else.
Wonderful. Well, everybody listening, I'll put all of Dr. Hartman's information in the show notes so you can find his work. You can find other places where you can hear about the things that he's doing with not just boys and young men, but with everybody in an effort to improve relationship and connection with each other. So thank you very much. And for all of my listeners, before we go, P.S.